Chapter 1. The jaws of a death trap were ready to close on the alkali-dusted Wadi in the boisterous Gila bar. As a piano jangled and roulette wheels clicked, hard-eyed hombres were shifting into line for a crossfire killing. At poker tables, swarthy peons fingered steel blades beneath red serapes. In a corner where the tobacco fog hung thick, a black-bearded scoundrel sat waiting to give the signal. Apparently unaware of treachery, their cowboy victim stood watching a faro game. His thumbs were hooked carelessly in the armholes of his travel-stained calfskin vest. His hat was a faded tan, and his bullhide chaps were scarred from recent brush riding. Deeply burned by sun and wind, he seemed nothing more than an honest, hard-working son of the cattle ranges. But the harmless unconcern of this young buckaroo, Rip Campbell, was a studied pose. As he pretended to figure the faro odds, he was really adding up his own chances in the coming game of powder and bullets. His gray eyes had missed nothing in the crowded saloon. He had tallied every drover belonging to herds waiting to cross the swollen Gila River. He had placed the drifting punchers who were quickly losing their stakes. He had taken the measure of the tough townies. It was too late for Rip to enlist aid in lawless Gila Bend. He had come alone, in pursuit of rustlers, to a town where men minded their own business and lived the longer for it. "The gang is ready to open a gun-smoke pot on me," he told himself, tensing. Blackbeard, in the corner, will lift a hand or get up from the chair. There are two gunnies behind me, and one on each side. The Mexicans cut me off from the doors. His lips drew in a straight line, and his gray eyes narrowed. Rip was a gambler, first, last, and always. Not for money. His bets were against the Owl Hoot tribe on the back trails. He had a growing reputation for recklessness in New Mexico and Arizona, where it was said that he was cursed with luck, and full of more tricks than a lobo. Now, ready for the worst, he leaned close to the faro table, elbowing aside two leathery players from a drover outfit. It looked as if he were to make a wager. But he was taking a long chance against almost impossible odds. He had already discovered that the faro dealer was palming crooked pasteboards out of the deck of cards in the table boot. At this moment, the stakes were high, and the house gambler was reaching for a final draw. With the speed of a striking panther, Rip's arm shot out. His fingers closed on the gambler's wrist and wrenched it painfully over. The tin horn's hand turned up to the view of the players, revealing a concealed card that should not have been there. "Cheat," Rip shouted, letting go of the man's wrist. "Yo-ee-ee." The faro dealer screamed in agony, and he went for a derringer cord dangling over the top of his checkered vest. Rip lost no time. He had no money on the table, and the fight with the gambler was not his affair. He was thinking of the gunman behind him. Ducking to the floor, Rip dived under the table. He heard the crash of chairs and the jingle of spurs. Players were roaring with rage. Men were scurrying for cover, knocking aside the gunmen who were out to get Rip. The thunder of exploding weapons shook the barroom. Leads struck into the floor behind Rip, narrowly missing him. He knew it was the gunman shooting at him. But other hombres were firing. The yowl of the faro gambler told that he had been struck by a cheated player. And other men yelled in agony as the house guards went into action. Rip scuttled under the table to its far end, with panic sweeping the Gila bar on all sides. In one stroke, he had made friends of those cheated trail drovers. "Wreck the joint!" he heard them shouting. "Clean out the crooked snake nest! Lynch the gamblers!" Crash! 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 Deafened by the explosions of powder and the smack of lead into ceiling and walls, Rip came out from under the far end of the table, jerking a weapon from his low-slung holster. His eyes darted to the battling crowds. He glimpsed a black-bearded man charging toward him with a drawn six-gun. It was the leader of the wrestling gang, and the fellow spied Rip, and he ducked to shoot. Wham! Rip triggered, his gun barrel spitting flame a yard long, driving hot lead into the black-bearded hombre's chest. The puncher's bullet knocked the outlaw over on his back, shooting wildly into the air. And as he kicked out his last on the floor, two gringo gunmen leapt over him to fight Rip. Again the Wadi fired, fanning his gun by brushing the left palm over the hammer. As the weapon kicked, bullets stopped the gringo pair in mid-air, threw them back, gurgling in death. They crashed beside their boss. Rip saw other hombres falling. Shotgun blasts raked the seething crowd of rioting customers. The faro table went over, with two men fighting on top of it. Chairs hurtled through the air. Bottles shattered against heads. And then an alarming cry went. Rip saw smoke and flame balloon up from several spots on the floor, where kerosene lamps had been hurled and man had ignited the oil-soaked planks out of vengeance. At the same time, he spied a Mexican leaping out of the struggling crowd. There was a drawn knife in the peon's hand, and he had only two more jumps before reaching the puncher. Rip threw up his smoking six-gun to parry the down-swooping blade. Steel clashed against steel. With a left fist, Rip drove the Mexican's swarthy face backward. The puncher followed the blow up by wrapping his gun barrel about the man's skull. He was at the feet of the black-bearded rustler boss, and he knelt to the floor, aware that the crowd was now stampeding toward the exits. Flame danced about them, and smoke swirled through the wrecked barroom, cloaking the corners and hiding the injured. Men yelled for parts and dragged strangers to open windows. Rip bent over the fallen outlaw. He had a gruesome task to accomplish in a short span of time. For a full week, the puncher had been trailing the rustling gang across sandwastes, through prickly pear, and canyons. Losing the cattle thieves during a series of cloudbursts, Rip had ridden on into Gila Bend, suspecting that the rustlers would not be able to ford the swollen river and would visit the town to celebrate their coup. Now, as Rip turned out the dead outlaw's pockets, he tried to identify the big, black-bearded scoundrel. But there was nothing to indicate where the gang had been going to sell the stolen stock or where it now was hidden along the bank of the Gila River. Rifle shells, tobacco, a knife, a watch, and wire clippers piled up on the floor beside the puncher. The smoke of the flaming bar was beginning to choke Rip, and he tore the buttons off the outlaw's shirt, searching for a money cache. His fingers touched a canvas belt, and he unfastened it. Drawing back, gasping for air, the waddy knew he'd have to get out of the saloon. It was then that he heard voices calling above the roar of the fire. Out of the swirling gray fog staggered two chapped hombres, searching for someone. "Gus!" one of the gunmen shouted. "Where are you?" "He's dead, I tell you," the other yelled. "Find his carcass, and get that ruby. It's in his money belt." With the canvas money belt in his left hand, Rip drew back into the smoke, hoping that the pair would not see him. But they spotted his dark figure. "It's Campbell!" one of the gunmen cried. "Shoot!" In the blinding smoke, Rip darted to the left, his own weapon whipping up. He saw powder flame lick out of the darkening fog and heard a bullet miss him. He triggered back at the place where the gun's fire had shone, and heard a scream. He threw himself to the planks, knowing that the second man would shoot, which the fellow foolishly did, driving a slug over Rip's head. Crash! Rip triggered again, and again, pumping lead through the smoke at his last foe. A body crashed to the floor. As it did, there was the roar of a beam breaking loose in the ceiling. Sparks showed down on Rip. Whirling, he raced toward a side window, guided by the rush of the smoke to the exit. He saw a square patch of gray light and leapt, headfirst. His head and shoulders went over the sill. He barked his shins, and his boot toes scraped on jagged pieces of glass. Falling outside the saloon, he dropped his gun and the money belt to use his hands to cushion his landing. He hit hard, his face slapping into the dirt, teeth grubbing up dirt. His brain seemed to explode, but he was not knocked out. Choking, sputtering, he got to his knees, feeling for his weapon and the canvas belt. In the near distance, men were cheering wildly. Now and then, a shot rang out, followed by several more, then another cheer. Hoofs thudded. Cowboy yips sounded. And then there was the thunder of beams falling within the saloon and more cheers from the main street. Rip got to his feet, opening his shirt to fasten the money belt under his clothes. He figured the shots in the main street to be the trail outfits and drovers celebrating their victory against the gamblers and saloon men. Turning in that direction, reloading his spent weapon, Rip moves through the smoke blowing from the barroom windows. He came to the plank sidewalk, darted across, and jumped down to a hitch rail where several broncs stood in terror of the flaming building. There was a crowd in the middle of the street, all watching the fire. Guns were in their hands, ready to stop any citizens from putting water on the saloon. Some of the drovers had taken bottles of liquor with them and were offering drinks. Others were bandaging injuries. Rip halted beside a big roan bronc covered with alkali dust. He had had enough fighting. Quietly, he was counting up the 5 dead outlaws left on the barroom floor and 1 Mexican. But 3 peons had escaped, though they might have been felled by cowboy bullets. The thudding of hoofs caught Rip's attention, and he glanced up the main street to see 3 riders racing into town. His breath caught. He thought he recognized the bald-headed weather-beaten hombre in the lead. The horseman's buckskin vest and trousers were familiar. "Suffering Joe," Rip exclaimed, and he yipped, raising an arm. The 3 riders jerked their heads in his direction, and a cowboy yell sounded. "Rip!" cried the toothless bald head in buckskin. "What's happened?" Rip Campbell swung to the saddle of the roan. He was thinking about the money belt fastened beneath his green velvet shirt. He wanted to get away with it. His curiosity had been whetted by what one of the outlaws in the Gila bar had said about a ruby. Besides, there might be valuable information in the canvas cache. Chapter 2. Spurring out from the hitch rail, Rip turned the roan up the main street, waving a quirt for his ranch foreman, Suffering Joe, and the two young hands to follow him. He couldn't account for their arrival in Big Bend. He hadn't told them that he was leaving the ranch on the trail of rustlers. Now, the leathery bald head pressed close to Rip's gelding, full of questions. "Who started the fire?" Suffering Joe demanded. "Are you running from trouble? Did you find the rustling scum?" "Pipe down and clear out," Rip Cayuse Crossing replied, grinning, for he knew his part would talk all day if invited. "Who said anything about rustlers? They were riding stirrup to stirrup at a fast canter. Didn't we hear that our neighbors lost over 200 head of white faces and a parcel of cutting broncs?" Suffering Joe exploded. "It was the Cayuse Crossing gang what turned the trick. Folks back home are betting 20 to 1 that you won't nab them. We ain't so dumb. We knowed you'd follow their tracks when them odds were out." Rip cast a glance over his shoulder to see if he was being followed, but the crowd still stood in front of the burning saloon, cheering its destruction. "Did you trail the stolen herd?" Rip asked Suffering Joe. "How else did we find out where you'd gone?" The bald head snapped. "I reckon I got lungs as dry as pie crust from eating alkali dust. I forgot the medicine for my awful case of stomach poison, and I've been in the last stages of agony all the way. Besides, I've been having dizzy spells and chills and fever and—" "Cut it out," Rip cried helplessly. "I can't stand your belly aching anymore. Where did you lose the tracks of the herd?" Past experience had taught him that Suffering Joe's ailments were entirely imaginary, and that the bald head was as hale and hearty as any whitey in New Mexico. The veteran wagon scout had got himself fired from a score of jobs because of his constant talk of pain and disease. Once, he had been a map maker for the Texas Rangers. There was hardly a square mile of country in the West that he had not been through. As a pathfinder, he couldn't be beaten. "We never lost no tracks," he said to Rip, pulling a long face. "But we know where you did. On that rim rock back about 40 miles. Rip sat up in the saddle. "You don't mean that you found the herd?" he said. "Sure," Suffering Joe replied. "It's 2 miles south of here in a sinkhole behind the Gila River. 3 Mexicans were guarding it, but we shot them dead as cooked rabbits." Rip's spurs went to the flank of his roan. 2 miles south," he said. "Scratch gravel, boys. I don't know how many hombres are left in that rustling gang. We've got to save that stock." Ahead, the country was a rolling waste of alkali, prickly pear, and volcanic rock hills. It was tough going on the Bronx, which had come far that day. Rip held his roan down to allow Suffering Joe and the two hands to keep up. Rip saw a lot more in Suffering Joe's story than he let on. If ranch neighbors were telling the world that Rip had accepted a wild dare to run the cattle thieves to earth, perhaps a spy left behind by the gang had brought word to Gila Bend that the cowboy was pursuing them. That was how they knew his name and had spotted him in the saloon. But Rip was not yet sure that the raiders were members of the Cayuse Crossing gang. His neighbors had been in the habit of blaming that new Al Hoot bunch for every bit of deviltry in the past year. It was said that the Cayuse Crossing gang had a rebranding stronghold on the Mexican border where the states of New Mexico and Arizona met. If attacked by posses from either state, the raiders could stampede their stolen stock across the international line, bringing it back again when the coast was clear. The foothills of the Sierra Madres offered 100 hidden canyons and chasms of escape. Now, riding southward, Rip recalled some of the hair-raising tales about the mountain post known as Cayuse Crossing. Range detectives who had prodded into the Owl Hoot nest had never been heard from again. The leader of the raiders was a mystery man, who gave his orders through gunslinging lieutenants. And death was meted out to those who failed to obey. The more Rip thought of the wild bunch at Cayuse Crossing, the stronger was his itch to try his luck against them. He figured he stood a better chance alone than with an outfit behind him. It was the unknown leader of the gang that he wanted to meet. For once the brains of any coyote pack was caught, past experience taught him that the members would scatter like frightened rabbits. A shout from Suffering Joe drew Rip's attention. They were rounding a patch of mesquite, and before them was a deep sinkhole hidden from the surrounding rock and sand waste. "They're gone!" the bald wagon scout yelled. "Look! We left the critters not 20 minutes ago." Rip drew his roan to a halt on the brink of the sunken bowl and leaned over his saddle pommel, gray eyes studying the 20 acres of natural corral. He could see that a herd had been milled in the hold because the buffalo grass was trampled, and in some places the roots had been torn up by hundreds of hoofs. "Where could they have gone in 20 minutes? the puncher asked, turning to the bald head. "The Gila River," Suffering Joe answered. "See where their trail leads over the south cliff." "But the river is too swollen to ford," Rip said, tugging his bridle reins in hand. "Let's see. We certainly didn't rub out all of that gang." The cow pony struck around the brink of the sinkhole at a rapid clip, one behind the other. Rip studied the earth, but not until he came to the south side of the natural corral did he find tracks. The trail led farther south to the edge of the river, and Rip could tell from the prints that the stock had been stampeded along. He followed the tracks swiftly across an alkali flat. They turned into an arroyo and down it. Riding hard, Rip saw the river lapping at the mouth of the defile. The trail led right into the muddy current. Slowing his bronc, the wadi looked across 30 yards of swift-moving water. He couldn't believe that the stock had swum the river at this point while a half-dozen trail outfits north of him were waiting for the flood to subside. Suffering Joe halted beside him. "They must have lost plenty of cows," the bald head growled. "Look at them critters washed up on the farther bank way below us. The dirty sneaks stampeded the herd right into the current and made them swim or drown." "I get it now," Rip said. "You see how the real current is right here at the mouth of the arroyo. The river bends below us, and the current shifts over to the other side. Once the cattle were caught in the fast water, they were washed like logs across the river and thrown up on the sandbar on the other side. It was a chance no decent drover would take." "That was the Cayuse crossing gang," Suffering Joe snapped. "How do you know?" Rip asked. "I can feel it in my sore bones," the wagon scout replied angrily. "Ain't they heading that stock toward the Mex border?" Rip's hands went to his shirt buttons. "Wait a minute," he said, reaching under his garb to the canvas belt. "I've got something here that might prove one thing or another." "If we swim that river," Suffering Joe said, "I'll catch my death and pneumonia. But if that scum went across, I can do it. Come on. They ain't getting away with that stock." "Hold on," Rip called, laying the canvas money belt across his lap as he sat in the saddle. "Let's take a peek into some of the pockets of this. I lifted it off an hombre called Gus. Ever hear of him?" Suffering Joe's eyes went wide. "Gus?" he questioned. "That must be Gus Hardy, who broke out of the state pen 5 years ago. You wouldn't remember that, Rip. But how come you ran into him?" Rip was emptying a pocket of the belt. $500 in fresh currency came to light. It looked like bank money, perhaps won at poker from a road agent or taken from a stage. Other pockets of the belt gave up almost the same amount in Mexican gold pesos, which was the safest kind of coin for bribes and making pay for vaqueros. The last pocket gave the wadi a shock. From it, he drew a red stone the size of a small olive and let it roll in the center of his palm. The sunlight caught on its smooth surface, and the stone seemed to take fire, tinting Rip's entire hand to a faint red. Wide-eyed, he stared at it, remembering what one of the outlaws had said in the saloon. "A ruby!" he ejaculated. "It must be worth a fortune." "Thunder and lightning!" Suffering Joe cried. "Get an eyeful of it." Like a glowing coal in a dying campfire, the stone's color changed every moment from a soft pink to a deep, gloomy red, and then back again. It seemed alive, full of strange magic. It was a gem that men would murder for, that women dreamed to own, a jewel so rare that it carried a history from the day of its find. "What was Gus Hardy doing with this ruby?" Rip asked in astonishment. Suffering Joe's saddle creaked, and he looked across the river. "He swiped it somewhere," he said coldly. "It must be bad luck. It's worth 2 times as many cattle as he stole." "The answer to this ruby lays across the river," Rip spoke out, placing the stone back into the canvas belt, which he strapped under his shirt. "It don't belong to us, nor does that fresh bank currency, or the gold coin. Are you hombres game to cross the river?" The 2 young punchers scowled at the muddy current, then gazed at Rip and Suffering Joe. "You're a boss," one of them said to Rip. "You lead, and we follow." "Sure," Suffering Joe said derisively. "Rip leads us right into the river, and we get potted from the opposite shore as soon as we start to drown in the middle. Me, I'm riding north a mile to the old ford to take a chance." A grin curled Rip's lips. "All right," he said. "North it is. Shake your hocks." Their broncs wheeled, and Suffering Joe led them back up the arroyo at a hot gait. Rip alone caught a flash of sunlight reflecting from a steel object in a willow thicket on the other side of the river. He did not let on that he had seen it. The flash could have come from a horse's bridle or the nickeled barrel of a rifle. Someone on the opposite shore had been spying on them, and that man had seen the ruby in Rip's palm. Chapter THRE. A mile above the arroyo, the 4 riders plunged into the muddy river at an old ford, where at normal times the current was only a foot deep. Now the water swirled past them at the 3-foot level, and in certain holes, it rose to 4 and 5, clutching at the broncs and trying to sweep them downstream to rocky rapids and death. It was Rip's idea to fasten lariats from one pommel to another. One animal alone would strike a deep spot, rear up, and flail the water with its hoofs, while the rest of the animals pulled it out of the hole. Wet to the skin, The outfit reached the farther bank, 50 yards away. The horses were exhausted, and Rip called a halt to let them blow. He had advised carrying ammunition under the crowns of their hats, and they had held rifles and 6 guns aloft. Before going on, the weapons were examined, found in working order, and carefully dried of any splashes. "They can't get away from us," Suffering Joe chuckled. "Now, let me tell you something. If they're strict for the border, they'll make for Massacre Arroyo, which leads up into the foothills of the mountains. We can slip around over a bench and stop them." "Good idea," Rip admitted. "But what if they turn tail and run out of the arroyo? Let me nail them from behind. I'll pick up their trail. You and the 2 hands hightail it ahead of them." Suffering Joe spat at the earth. "They might be planning an ambush," he said. "Don't stumble into it." "I'll watch my step, and you take care of yours," Rip retorted. They separated, Suffering Joe and the 2 wadis spurring westward into the thickets of mesquite that covered the sloping hills of the Sierra Madres. Rip turned due south, keeping to the cover of the willows on the flooded riverbank. His bronc was faster than the animals with Suffering Joe, and he could give the rustlers a running fight, if necessary. Remembering that a spy had watched him at the place where the cattle crossed the river, Rip took his time and kept concealed. Gun in hand, he halted now and then to listen for danger. He preferred working alone. His single roan made less noise. It was trained to move silently and not answer the nicker of another bronc. For a good mile, the puncher traveled down the river, then stopped. Dismounting, he tethered the bronc to a tree and slipped through the willows on foot, until he came to the spot where the herd had been swept upon a sandbar by the current. The bank was trampled, the brush beaten down, and the trail led on into a clump of cottonwoods. Rip fell behind a heap of rock, ears cocked for the sound of the foe. He remained there for several minutes, thinking he might catch the grunt of a waiting horse or detect the odor of cigarette smoke. Sure that the rustler spy had gone on after the other cattle thieves, the wadi walked out into the open and hiked to the cottonwoods. Ahead of him, he saw the opening of an arroyo, which might be the one that Suffering Joe had said went back into the foothills. The tracks of the stock pointed into it. Rip went back for his roan, swung to the saddle, and trotted out of the willows. He rode on into the cottonwoods toward the arroyo. His eyes were focused on the distant hills, where a cloud of dust would tell where the herd was moving. He never thought to look up into the shade of the high, spreading branches of the cottonwood trees. And so he missed sight of a ragged figure clinging to an overhanging limb which the roan passed under. The olive-skinned figure plummeted downward as Rip went by. There was a rush of wind too late to warn him. Like a panther, the foe landed on Rip's shoulder, arms encircling his neck. The puncher's head snapped back, and a cry broke from his throat. He was carried over backward in the saddle, his spine bending across the cantle. Agonized, he tried to wrench to the left to throw the enemy off his shoulders, and he went sliding over the rump of the bronc. The roan reared, and as it did, Rip felt a deadly rawhide thong draw tight about his neck. His bulging eyes sighted the ground lifting up to meet him. He threw out hands to break his fall, but he landed with a crash that shook every bone in his body. The 6-gun that he had been unable to use bounced from his fingers as he rolled over, kicking and bucking like a colt. With a wrench, he heaved the figure loose from his back and reached to his neck to claw the rawhide free from his throat. Half blinded, he lunged at the foe who had tried to choke him, but the figure rolled clear of him, shouting, "Up with the hands, gringo. I shoot." Then, Rip saw the ragged figure, and an exclamation of astonishment echoed from his lips. It was a Mexican youth of not more than 14 years. Barefooted, clad in smelly rags, as dirty as a hound pup that had been sporting in a bog, the small hombre was on his knees, a .32 caliber gun in his steady hand. His dark eyes were narrowed to slits, and his jaw was thrust forward. It seemed almost impossible that the youngster had been the foe that dropped from out of the tree and dragged Rip down from the bronc, fighting for his life. "Buzztails!" the wadi gasped, lifting a hand to brush sweat from his brow. "What's sticking in your craw, partner?" He tried to grin, but the deadly aim of the small caliber gun was too much for him. "You speak in riddles," the Mexican youth snarled. "I wish the ruby." "Give it up." "The ruby?" Rip questioned. "What ruby?" The youngster's lips drew back over his teeth. "Senor, it would be easy for me to shoot," he said, "then take the jewel which belonged to my family. I have no time to waste. I have no use for a gringo. Make it what you call snappy." Rip swallowed hard. He was beginning to realize that the hombre before him was no ordinary peon kid. The younker's English was too good for that. And under the grime that disguised his face, Rip could see good Spanish heritage. There was going to be no tricking him. The kid meant business with that gun. He had taken a desperate chance, and had won thus far. "Sure," Rip said. "The gem ain't mine. You say it belongs to your family. How come they don't have it now?" His hand went to the buttons of his shirt, and he reached inside to the canvas belt. "You are wise, senor," the young hombre said. "I knew you would cross the river. I waited for you like a puma in the tree. You will go back across the Gila again to your friends. Those cattle are not worth your risk. I advise you as one who knows." Rip tossed the canvas belt across to his captor. His alarm was fading, and a grin tugged at the corners of his lips. He thought of Suffering Joe heading off the rustlers in the upper part of Massacre Arroyo, and he wondered what this lad had to do with the stolen cattle. The kid couldn't be a range waif. He had mentioned a family. Rip had had other experiences with border youngsters and knew their courage and adventurous spirit. "Are you a member of those raiders?" he asked casually. The Mexican boy scooped up the belt with a deft hand and felt the pockets for the telltale bulge of the precious stone. "It is here," he said aloud, his dusky face lighting up. "I want none of Senor Hardy's dinero. You killed him, gringo, and saved me the trouble." And keeping Rip covered, he unfastened the pocket of the ruby. "Wait a second," the puncher ejaculated. "Let me get you straight. What do you know about Gus Hardy? We might be partners. It looks like we have no fight." The boy brought the flaming ruby to the light of the sun, stole a glance at it, then started to inch toward the spot where Rip's lost weapon lay. "I speak no more," he said savagely. "I take your gun. I am a lobo. Go back across." The echo of a shot cut him short, and Rip jerked his head to look toward the opening of the arroyo beyond the cottonwoods. The wadi heard more shots, yells, and the thudding of hoofs. He knew that Suffering Joe had intercepted the rustlers and put them to flight. Riders were coming down the arroyo at a breakneck pace. "Let me have my gun," Rip cried. "You can have my word that I won't touch the ruby. I'll play square. There's trouble popping, hombre. My outfit has cut off the rustling gang. They might trap you." Now, out of the arroyo, two ragged peasants raced on galloping broncs, headed straight for Rip and the Mexican boy. A shout sounded. The riders had seen them, and were coming on. Rip took a desperate chance. He sensed that the kid was staring at the arroyo. So he lunged at the young fellow. Rip's left hand flashed out, grabbing the barrel of the small-caliber weapon, deflecting it. But the youngster did not trigger. Rip tore the gun away, and with the right hand snatched up his own Colt .45 from the earth. 50 yards separated him from the charging peons. Rifles were at their shoulders. Crash. The riders fired, but their aim was wild from the galloping horses. Throwing himself flat on the earth in front of the young hombre to protect him, Rip braced his elbow and triggered. As thunder broke from his gun, he saw one of the peons jerked back in the saddle. With a yell, the Mexican fell over the flank of his horse. Wham! Rip shot again, at the second, who was turning to the left. The cowboy missed him. But at that moment, Suffering Joe's Pinto came racing out of the arroyo. Suffering Joe was shooting, and the second Mexican fell whirling to his death. "Got him!" Suffering Joe yelled. "Rip! What you doing down here? I told you to meet us up the arroyo. We chased them coyotes for 2 miles." Rip Campbell turned to eye the tight-lipped boy behind him. "I should have known," the young fellow growled. "The gringo is too smart for me." His eyes locked with Rip's. "You gave me your word," he said. "Am I to be what you call double-crossed?" Rip chuckled, reloading his spent weapon from his cartridge belt. "I reckon not, hombrecito," he replied, employing a Spanish word for little man. "But I do think you owe me an explanation about that ruby. You said it belonged to your family. Who are you?" The boy raised up from the earth, squaring back his shoulders, his eyes flashing. "I am Don Felipe Ramos," he said proudly. "My father, he was murdered by gringo raiders. Senor Hardy was one of them. The coyote is now dead. But others remain. With your permission, senor, I will settle with them." Suffering Joe's horse came trotting up, and the bald head asked from the saddle, "What's the kid doing here?" "Ever hear of Con Felipe Ramos?" Rip inquired. "An old friend of mine," Suffering Joe replied. "He's got one of the wealthiest ranges in Chihuahua. I met him when I was with the Texas Rangers. He gave us a bail once. We rode 2 weeks to get to the dance, but it was worth it." "Texas Rangers," the boy who called himself Don Felipe Ramos echoed. "You were the friend of my father." "I do not remember." "Maybe not," Rip laughed. "Suffering Joe was with the Rangers before you were born. He's working for me now. You've got the ruby, and here's your gun, partner. We've got our cattle. The poker game is over." "Not for me," the young hombre said desperately, and his eyes fastened hard upon the punchers. "Am I free to go?" he asked. Rip nodded, resisting a desire to question him further. He felt that the stubborn resistance of the youth was fast melting away. He could tell that the boy was lonely, and in need of a friend, but fiercely suspicious. The ragged youngster's lips quivered. Something inside of him snapped, and he staggered back, almost tripping. Rip leapt to catch him. "Break out some grub, you ornery rattlesnakes," he called to the punchers. "This kid is almost starved to death." Chapter 5. After a hearty meal of beans, jerky, and coffee, Rip's outfit finally coaxed the lad to share his story. Kindness was the key to unlocking his tight lips. Don Felipe Ramos, the son of the recently deceased rancher, revealed that he was the sole survivor of the rustling gang. His father had ridden with them, keeping watch over their horses outside the Gila bar. From a vantage point, Don Felipe witnessed Rip gunning down Gus Hardy, an act he had eagerly awaited for 2 months. A year prior, Gus Hardy was part of a gang that raided the Ramos Ranch in Chihuahua, committing atrocities and stealing valuable gems, including a ruby that now rested in Don Felipe's palm. His father had prophesied that these gems would sustain his mother's life in Mexico City. When Rip inquired about the appearance of the other gang members with Gus Hardy, Don Felipe explained that he couldn't identify them without revealing himself. Having taken an oath to avenge his parents, Don Felipe traced the stolen steers to Cayuse Crossing in the Sierra Madres, where the brands were changed. Working undercover, he curried their horses and cleaned stables, secretly searching for an opportunity to expose the gang. On the previous night, he discovered the ruby on Gus Hardy and awaited the right moment to extract information about the other murderers. Suffering Joe grunted in surprise at the revelation. Don Felipe, desperate and resolute, planned to return to Cayuse Crossing, posing as a messenger sent by Gus Hardy to relay a false cattle sale announcement. Rip considered visiting Cayuse Crossing himself, expressing interest in the cutting broncs. Suffering Joe cautioned against it, foreseeing danger due to Rip's known involvement in the recent saloon fight. Suggesting an alternative, he proposed rallying drover outfits across the river to confront the outlaws. However, Rip insisted on a riskier plan. He would rebrand the cutting broncs, posing as a horse thief to infiltrate the gang and identify its leaders. Don Felipe, alarmed at the perilous proposition, warned Rip about the formidable desperados in Cayuse Crossing. Despite Suffering Joe's attempts to dissuade him, Rip was undeterred. He tightened his gun belt, signaling his determination, leaving his loyal companion dismayed. The gambler in Rip couldn't resist the allure of the daring adventure that lay ahead. Don Felipe, after sketching a plan of the surrounding area in the sand, departed on his Indian pony, disappearing up the arroyo with a wave of his arm. Rip saddled his roan and entered the arroyo to locate the remaining cattle. Only 170 steers were left from the original herd of 200 due to the stampede caused by 3 Mexicans eager to sell the stock to stolen cattle buyers in Cayuse Crossing. To conceal the brands of the cutting broncs, Rip built a fire, but initially, Suffering Joe refused to assist, grumbling like an old bear. Amidst banter about disguises, Rip persuaded the reluctant baldhead to lend a hand. As they rebranded the broncs, Rip emphasized the importance of keeping the original brands hidden to avoid suspicion in Cayuse Crossing. The process consumed the late afternoon, and Rip set out, leaving Suffering Joe in 2 hands with the steers. The old baldhead's grumbling persisted as Rip rode away, waving a quirt, and Suffering Joe shook a fist in response. Rip faced a night of extensive riding under the stars and a foreboding red moon. Despite the ominous color, Rip disregarded the warning and pressed on through high benches, canyons, and mesas, following Don Felipe Ramos's well-marked trail. After a brief rest and breakfast, he entered a dry region of tall buttes and mesas, nearing the border. A rocky ridge led him to a deep basin, marking the beginning of a maze of chasms and mesquite forests. Rip recognized he was on the right trail as canyons opened through the ridges, providing numerous hiding places. Spotting the town of Cayuse Crossing on a mesa about 10 miles away, Rip navigated through sinkholes, prickly pear, and arroyos before reaching the foot of the mesa cliff. He paused to prepare himself, tightening his belt, checking his 6-gun, and taking a deep breath. Guiding his horse up the narrow trail, Rip pondered the mysterious boss of Cayuse Crossing, whose identity remained elusive, a challenging adversary. The town was a breeding ground for outlaws, and any encounter held the potential danger of facing the gunning ghost who controlled the Owl Hoot town. The uncertainty hung in the air as Rip climbed the ledge, ready to confront whatever awaited him at the top. Chapter 5. There was no one to impede the puncher on the rim of the mesa. Again, he halted, gazing across 100 acres of lush grass and clumps of cedars. In the center of the tableland stood a cluster of cabins. He discerned a short main street, corrals, and a livery. It had the appearance of a small trading post, peaceful and lazy in the morning sun. Rip urged the horses toward the town, feeling his nerves tense. Unconsciously, he brushed the butt of his six-gun with his fingers. Now, men sprawled in chairs on the plank sidewalks came into view before cabins and rickety stores. Broncs were tied to hitch rails, flicking flies with their tails, heads hung low. At the main street's head, a wagon with a load of hay was parked before a livery. Rip directed his horses into an empty corral beside the livery, waving his hat to chase the animals inside. Dismounting, he closed the corral gate and tethered his horse to the rails. Throughout, he was aware of the eyes of onlookers in the town. The hay wagon departed, leaving two tough-looking hombres in front of the livery. Rip strolled toward them, appearing tired and unkempt from 2 days without washing. His borrowed buckskin shirt was thick with dust, and his blue denims had long rips. However, his gun and holster were wiped clean. Hat cocked back, he approached the pair before the livery and greeted them with a casual howdy. The taller hombre, with a hawkish nose and tight thin lips, and the runt, with bowed legs and a snarling rat terrier-like face, both armed with double guns, acknowledged Rip. The cowboy revealed his intention to sell broncs and asked for directions. The tall hombre scrutinized the corral and asked about the brand. Sensing their suspicion, Rip stated, "Boxed Cross." The runt concealed a sly grin and headed into the livery. The taller man remarked casually about the Cayuses having sore sides, and Rip, scowling, admitted to it. He was directed to see Bill Rand 2 doors down at the Cayuse Crossing bar. As Rip stepped back, he feigned surprise, asking if this was Cayuse Crossing. The tall hombre growled affirmatively, and Rip, still aware of scrutiny, walked up the plank sidewalk, jingling his spurs. Amidst the searching glances, he suddenly spotted a ragged figure against the building 2 doors down. A chill ran through him, but Rip continued into the bar, where he saw Don Felipe's head lift without recognition. The kid glanced at him, showing no acknowledgement. Inside the empty saloon, Rip approached the bar, and a bartender, securing a dirty white apron, inquired about his preference. Rip expressed his intention to see Bill Rand about selling broncs. The bartender called for Bill, who arrived with a daredevil demeanor, over 6 feet tall, with a tan face and a touch of a dude. Rip declined a drink, stating his need for sleep after a long ride. Bill Rand, eyeing Rip's dusty appearance, asked where he was from, and Rip responded cautiously with North. When questioned about the brand, Rip claimed, "The horses are wearing a boxed cross," emphasizing that he had branded them only the day before. Bill Rand, with a knowing smile, suggested checking the horses later and offered an empty cabin across the street for some rest. Rip felt a chill, realizing that delay meant investigation. Accepting the offer, Rip turned to see Don Felipe entering the bar room. The boy addressed Bill Rand, asking about taking Rip to the cabin. Bill Rand ordered him to lead Rip to the cabin, fetch water from the spring, and Don Felipe complied. They crossed the plank sidewalk and entered the ramshackle cabin, saying nothing as Don Felipe opened the door, motioning Rip inside. The waddy walked into a large single room with a bunk against the rear wall, and Rip tested the straw mattress. "PSTTTL," the boy warned him. Turning, Rip saw him standing with a finger to his lips. Don Felipe's eyes were on a back window. Rip took the hint and said, "Forget the water until later. I'm tuckered out. You can wake me in 2 hours." "In 2 hours," Don Felipe replied and went out. Rip sat down on the bunk, ears cocked. He heard gravel crunch outside the rear window. A spy was slipping away. Grinning, he stretched out on the straw mattress. "There's nothing I can do now," he told himself quietly. "I'll just have to play my cards close to my chest and wait for them to make a bet." His eyes closed, and he breathed deeply. His muscles ached. He lay thinking about Bill Rand and the 2 liverymen. Could any one of them be the mysterious boss of Cayuse Crossing? What about the idle men in chairs outside other cabins? How long would it be before Rip got a good look at them? To all appearances, the town was a lazy frontier post. It looked harmless in the sun. And that was the way a coiled rattler looked. Cayuse Crossing was just as deadly. Its venom was concealed in its swift striking fangs. Rip's mind drifted back to Suffering Joe, to the fight in the Gila bar, and slowly he fell into a doze. He didn't know how long he slept. What woke him was the creak of a plank. Like a startled cat, Rip reared up in the bunk, hand slapping to the butt of his 6-gun, eyes wide to glimpse his enemy. He saw the ragged Don Felipe crouched on the floor before his bunk. The boy's face was white. A finger was at his lips. Rip gulped and let go of his gun butt. "What is it?" he whispered. "They know," the lad replied in a low tone. "Be careful." Sound carries far. I came by the back window. What do they know? Rip asked breathlessly. Senior Rand, he shot one of the cayuses, Don Felipe said, head cocked to one side, as if he were listening for something outside the cabin. He peeled off the hide, and the real Triangle Bar brand showed plain beneath. He knows that Gus Hardy was stealing Triangle Bar cows and horses. He has sent a rider to Gila Bend. Rip swung his legs over the rim of the bunk. You better get out of here, he advised. If Rand tries to stop me from leaving town, I'll shoot it out with him. No good, the boy growled. You could not get off the mesa. You need a bronc. The town has been warned. Everywhere you go, you'll be under the aim of rifles. They will kill you at the first false move. They got me cornered, eh? Rip snapped. They're waiting to find out who I am. I get the idea. They think they'll draw me into a sucker game of cards. You better vamos. And no matter what happens, take no hand in the pot. If I go down, several of the coyotes will go with me, and I hope the brains of the gang are among them. Don Felipe was sneaking to the rear window. I help, he said, and threw a leg over the sill. Then he was gone like a shadow. Rip loosened his six-gun in his holster and turned to the front door. Stepping out into the sunlight, he was surprised to find that the town's main street looked no different. Men still sat in chairs tilted against the back of cabins. Horses stood with heads hanging at the hitch rail. He strode across the plank sidewalk, jumped down to the dirt of the street, and headed toward the Cayuse crossing bar. A shiver went down his spine. He knew how easy it would be for a marksman to put a bullet into his back. Jumping up to the plank walk, he pushed his way through the swinging doors of the saloon, and once more found the room empty. Anybody in? Rip called. Just a second, the voice of Bill Rand called from a back room. Rip turned to see the tall, tanned hombre enter the bar. There was a cool grin on Bill Rand's lips. It was the smile of a gambler, and there was no telling what was going on in his mind. Have a good sleep? The saloon man asked. Thanks, Rip said, forcing a casualness that he didn't feel. Bill Rand went behind the bar and reached for glasses. Those broncs look good, he was saying. We'll have a drink. Rip felt a keen alarm. He could not see what Bill Rand was doing with his hands below the bar. There might be a six-gun hidden on a shelf, and his fingers might be closing over the butt. The handsome hombre faced Rip, still grinning. I'll pass the drink, the puncher said. Rand chuckled. Folks say you never touch the stuff, he said casually. It slows up your gun speed, don't it? Rip's muscles tensed. Chapter 6. For a long moment, they eyed each other, like two gamblers across a table covered with gold and cards. Who says I don't drink? Rip challenged. Careful, Campbell, Bill Rand replied coldly. I've got a gun in my fist, we can talk this out. I'll trade your life for the ruby. The ruby, Rip exclaimed, right shoulder dropping low. Don't try to draw, Campbell, Bill Rand growled. One of Gus's outfits saw you with his canvas belt in the saloon. You thought you killed Gus's whole gang. That fellow whom you shot in the fire got away with a bullet through his lung. I sent a peon to Gila Bend not 15 minutes ago. The peon found that wounded hombre just outside the mesa and learned the truth. Nobody else in town knows it yet. Do we make a deal or don't we? Rip's heart was pounding against his ribs. He knew he was trapped. He doubted if he'd get his hand on his gun butt before Bill Rand would kill him. He sensed a deadly cunning in the man, and he realized that Bill Rand was set on owning the precious stone. You aim to double-cross the boss of Cayuse Crossing, eh? Rip challenged. It's no go, Rand. I'll take my chances against him instead of you. Maybe I'll live longer. Rand's handsome face changed color, and his eyes glinted. They say that you're a fool, he snarled. You don't know when to quit. I'm offering you a chance for your life. Tell me where you hid the ruby, and I'll give you free passage off the mesa. Don't, and I'll shoot you down like a rat, Rip laughed at him. Ain't you satisfied with the emerald, the sapphire, and the diamond? He asked, cocking his head on one side. You wouldn't know about the ruby unless you had been in on the Ramos raid in Mexico. Bill Rand's hand lifted from behind the bar. It gripped a cocked .45. The barrel swerved to cover Rip's heart. Too smart for your own good, Campbell, the outlaw sneered. Maybe you've got the ruby in your clothes. Maybe you hid it in the cabin. I'll find it. The hombre you shot in Gila Bend is dead, and so is the peon that found him staggering through the basin. That gringo was Duke Thomas, who held the sapphire of the Ramos loot. I've got that now. I've got my own stone. The ruby is next. And I'll have the last one. You'll never find the ruby, Rip said calmly. Which is your gem, the diamond or the emerald? You couldn't be the boss of Cayuse Crossing, or you'd have taken all the loot, "You double-crossing, tin-horn dude." He hardly finished before he ducked low to the floor, catching Bill Rand unawares. The flame of the saloon man's weapon almost caught Rip's descending cheek. The bullet went through his hair. And as the puncher hit the planks, he drew his weapon with the speed of lightning. The thunder of Rand's gun was still shaking the rafters as Rip threw himself upward from the floor on the rebound. He was cocking his weapon as he came. He caught Bill Hardy thumbing the hammer of his own gun and ducking back behind the bar. Their eyes locked. Crash. Rip fired, stabbing his gun forward as if it were a foil. His bullet threw Rand back against the wall with the shelves of glasses. The saloon man couldn't trigger. His mouth opened, and a scream tore from his throat. He fell, breaking down the shelves, bringing glasses and bottles to the floor with him. Rip didn't halt to make sure that Rand was dead. Whirling, he raced for the back door and leapt into a rear office room. At that moment, the back entrance burst open, and a ragged figure darted inside. Rip held his fire none too soon. "Don Felipe," he cried. "Get out, pard. I've nailed Bill Rand. Ride for Suffering Joe." The boy halted, panting for breath. "Suffering Joe," he exclaimed. "He comes." "What?" Rip gasped. "Where?" Don Felipe slammed the back door shut and locked it, then drew a six-gun from under his rags. "Look to the main street, senor," he called. "A rider just came to give the alarm. Senor Suffering Joe is between Cayuse Crossing and the border. He has 50 armed men with him. He cuts off escape to Mexico. He must have the trail drovers from Gila Bend." Rip whirled, darting into the barroom. His gun was in his hand, and it was well that he had it ready. He saw the front doors of the saloon darken. He spied a tall, thin hombre leaping into the barroom, weapon out. It was the cadaverous-faced livery owner. Rip ducked low, his six-gun crashing. He knew he was hitting the thin coyote as the weapon kicked. He saw the man jerk to the left from the impact of a bullet. The hollow-cheeked fellow fired as he turned, and his lead went into the wall. He broke at the knees, grunting, weapon twisting from his fingers. His eyes rolled back, and he fell face down on the floor, muttering as death reached to take him. "The diamond," he was saying. "Rand's got the diamond. It's mine as much as—" He was dead. Rip's ears went deaf from the shouting in the main street. He heard the squeal of horses bitten by spurs. Boots pounded the plank sidewalk. "Keep away from the saloon," voices yelled. "Boppy Smiler has gone gunning for Rand." Rip signaled to Don Felipe to get over behind the bar. The kid went with a run, and Rip knew he was bent on searching Bill Rand. Moving to a window that overlooked the main street, Rip saw riders streaking northward out of town to the safety of the hidden canyons of the basin. Like panic-stricken rabbits, they were scattering before the puncher posse that cut off their escape across the Mexican border. Rip turned to the front door, and found Don Felipe dragging the body of the thin liveryman into the room. The puncher glanced out the door to the south, and he saw a swarm of riders come onto the mesa, war-whooping, waving rifles. In their lead was a bald-headed hombre in a green velvet shirt and calfskin vest. Rip chuckled. "Them duds improve his looks a lot," he said, wheeling to look at Don Felipe. The boy was drawing a glittering emerald from the watch pocket of the thin liveryman. "The last," Don Felipe looked up to say. "Senor Rand had the sapphire and the diamond." Rip scowled. "But who is the boss of Cayuse Crossing?" Don Felipe got to his feet. "No one man, senor," the boy said solemnly. "It was 4 men, Gus Hardy, Duke Thomas, Bill Rand, and Boppy Smiler. It was a trick to frighten their gangs." Rip studied the young hombre. "How do you know that?" he asked. "The diamond," Don Felipe answered. "It is the most valuable stone." But Bill Rand was not quick with the gun like Boppy Smiler. He could not be Senor Smiler's boss. Bill Rand had not the rustling brains of Gus Hardy. Only Duke Thomas, whom you shot in the Gila bar, could do the rebranding tricks on stolen stock. Rip listened to the pounding of hoofs entering the main street. "I reckon you're right, partner," he said. "But we're going to have a tough time convincing Suffering Joe. He'll spend the next month searching the canyons and pair for the boss of Cayuse Crossing." Don Felipe came forward, hand outstretched. "You, and you alone, have avenged my father and mother," he said. "I have done nothing. I am humble before you. I am your servant, senor." Rip's face turned scarlet. "Forget it," he said. "I want to find Morgan Colt from an old hombre back home by cleaning out this town. That's good enough for me. I'd have gone through twice as much to prove that neighbor of mine in the wrong." "Senor is a gambler," Don Felipe smiled. "For a Colt, he risked his life. But what of Senor Suffering Joe?" "Oh, he's too dumb to know any better," Rip replied, hearing a step in the doorway. The voice of Suffering Joe spoke from the front entrance. "He ain't too dumb to know that he looks like a yammerin' jackass in this dude outfit. Give me back my buckskins, afore I start shootin'. I'll catch the green pip from this here shirt."